All right, I'm recording now. Hello, everyone out there in internet land. Welcome once again to the Monarch Science blog. This is the place where the latest research around the monarch butterfly gets disseminated into real-world, everyday language. In other words, it's science for the monarch masses. So I recently blogged about a new study showing how parasites are in monarchs. There's a parasite in monarchs that is increasing throughout the eastern United States. And this is something that is clearly harming the population. This blog caused quite a stir, since I think most people weren't aware of this growing problem with the monarchs. And from my observations, this problem seems to be being made worse by a number of human activities. I'm pointing this out today because today's topic is quite closely related to this one. Today I'm talking with Tiffany Moore, a butterfly specialist with the Miami Zoo. She asked if I would provide some comments on the current state of monarch affairs in Florida, which I'm happy to do. Now, originally, this was just going to be a quick one-on-one chat by Zoom, but I've gotten more than a few questions from people in Florida about monarchs, and since that blog went public. So I thought it would be nice to record this conversation and post it on the blog so that others could hear what I had to say about this issue in Florida. I guess that is if they want to hear what I have to say. So here we go. So this will be an unscripted conversation about monarchs in Florida, their parasites, and what people should do about this issue. So I'm going to turn it over to my special guest, Tiffany. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you maybe tell me about yourself and what you do there, because we've never met before, and it would be good for folks seeing this to hear what you do.
Sure. I work at Zoo Miami in the Conservation and Research Department. In our department, there's only 3 of us. So we cover some basic species. I do Lepidoptera, and my colleagues and supervisor work with a number of Costa Rican amphibians, Florida flamingos, gopher tortoises, endangered species like the Florida bonneted bat and the Miami tiger beetle. So what I primarily do is I actually work in a retired military bunker. The zoo was actually a Navy base during World War II. And it was decommissioned, and the county ended up buying the property to form the zoo in the 1970s. And then it was actually formally opened in 1980. So because of the military base, we actually have bunkers on property still, and we use them for storage spaces and various things. But we actually transformed one of the bunkers to be an ambient laboratory. So it actually sits within the forest, the pine rockland forest, and it doesn't have any connection to the zoo. So it's 100% sustainable. It has solar panels, 2 small wind turbines, and a rain catch. So that's where I work every day. And I work with a number of local butterflies in South Florida.
So when you say you work with them, what do you actually do? Do you do like captive rearing, or do you do outreach, or what do you mean?
Both. So I work with the Atala hair streak a lot, and we have a program with the Fairchild Tropical Botanical Garden, and I exchange butterflies to members of Fairchild Garden who meet the criteria in their yard that have the certain host plants for the Atalas and has to have a number of nectar sources to have a colony within their yard. How
many of those are left?
What do you mean left?
Of that hair streak?
Oh, it's bounced back. In the 1960s, that Atala actually was thought to have been extinct, but people plant the host plant, the kunti, in like roadsides and in landscaping. People got really used to putting it into their yards, so the population of the butterfly bounced back.
I wanted to make that clear, because I think people have the same idea about the monarch, that it's in that kind of, it's in the same, but it's nowhere even, it's not even in the same ballpark, right? That hair streak was almost extinct, and your programs like this sort of help to save it. but the monarch isn't in that category.
Right.
Yeah.
So that I also do some life history work on some Lepidoptera that hasn't really been so modern in the literature. So I recently published a paper on the faithful beauty moth and its life history. And the latest literature was in the 1900s before mine. So I
Nice.
did some life history and it was just published in December. And then I'm currently writing a manuscript for the lesser wasp moth, which is still considered a rare and imperiled species of moth here.
So you're a legitimate lepidopterist, and you're the person that people come to with questions about the monarch.
I get a lot of questions. I try to steer them in a direction of not raising them in their backyard because I know it can be troublesome for people. I've heard comments that some people run out of tropical milkweed, so they go to a box store and they purchase more, and then all of their colony dies and they don't know why. And so I try to give them the answers as best I can and try to steer them more towards native milkweeds and local nurseries instead of box stores.
All right, so this is a good segue, and so I take it you wanted to hear from me because of this new study that came out, right, with the parasites.
Yes.
Okay, and then before we get into that, are there any other concerns that people have? What else do people sort of come to you with questions about, or where you want me to weigh in on?
It's mainly the milkweed issue. We do have a good partnership with the Fairchild Tropical Botanical Garden. They have some researchers on their conservation plant team where they're propagating the native milkweeds and putting them back into the pine rockland preserves and native habitat. So whenever I find the native milkweeds on our pine rockland fragment, I try to monitor them. And if they start to develop seed pods, then I will bag it so that we can take those seed pods, give them back to Fairchild, and they can continue propagating them. What they want to do, I believe, is to grow enough of them to flood the local nurseries so that it's more widely available. Because I think one of the biggest issues is that people want to have milkweed, but they can't find the natives or they don't know about the natives. So we want to just change that direction.
So what do people know about the monarch population in Florida?
I believe that many people think that there are two scenarios happening. One being that there are resident populations that stay, that never migrate, and two, that some migrate. So it can be very confusing, and because of our tropical weather and the tropical milkweed doesn't die back, many people don't know that they should be cutting the plant back because of OE.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So I guess the place to start, I guess, might be the OE issue, right? So in Florida, if people weren't aware, they should be. Florida is a hotbed for OE. And in some ways it always has been, but in some ways it's worse now. So there has long been a resident population of monarchs in southern Florida, down where you are. And we've known about this for decades, that there's some monarchs in Florida that just don't migrate. They're permanently resident. We've also known for decades that those monarchs tend to be heavily infected because they don't have a migration. And because we think the migration sort of weeds out all of the sick individuals. So we've known about that for a while. However, in the past 20 years or so, this small resident population has turned into a larger resident population throughout the entire state of Florida. And I think people have sort of conflated the issue, thinking that all of Florida is supposed to be resident. And so people have sort of gotten the idea that it's okay to plant tropical milkweed down there because our monarchs in Florida don't migrate. But it was never that way. It was always just the monarchs in Miami.
Right.
And so now the entire state of Florida has tropical milkweed because, number one, people think that the monarch is in trouble and they need to plant milkweed. And number two, because they think that the entire state of Florida doesn't need to migrate. So those two issues there are probably, neither of them is helping the monarch's cause. Because right now, the entire state of Florida is I mean, I've said it in a newspaper article once, it's a cesspool of diseased monarchs. Just for grins, let me see if I can share my screen, and I'm going to connect to my wife's website, the Monarch Health Project. And let me see if I can share my screen here. I want to share this screen. So for folks who don't know in Florida, they should know about this. So my wife is the world expert on this parasite, and she runs the Monarch Health Project, which is run from here at UGA. She asks volunteers to sample the adult monarchs that they see, either if they raised them or if they caught them. She asked people to sample these for this parasite, and it's very simple. It's non-invasive. And then she asked them to send those samples here to the lab, where she gets people to examine them to see if the parasite is there. And so if you look at this website, you can go to the interactive map page right here. I'll click on that. And you can see this map that comes up. I'll make it bigger. This is a map of the US. And these are all, each of these points is a collection of monarchs that was scored for parasites by her team. And let's zoom in down here to Florida. Is this showing up on your screen?
It is.
Yeah. And so the thing to keep in mind here is, you look over here, the infection prevalence from these dots is highlighted in these colors, and black is bad. Black means that of all of this monarchs sampled from that location, most of them were heavily infected with OE. This is heavily infected, not just a few spores here and there, heavily infected. And so if you look at the state of Florida, it looks pretty bad. Basically, everywhere you look in Florida, there's moderate to severe OE infections in Florida. And remember what I said, it didn't used to be that way. It used to be that all of the monarchs that were in Florida tended to be down here. And I even went back, before this conversation, I went back to look at some early literature on this. And I have a paper from the 1950s from the late Lincoln Brower, who used to come down here to Florida on a regular basis. This is before he was at Gainesville. He was at Gainesville for a long time. And then, but before that, in the 1950s, he would come down here to the Archibald Biological Station, which is right around here. And he would look for monarchs. And he reports in an early study that he found a few monarchs wintering around this area. And he actually reports that there was even one sighting of tropical milkweed. It was in next to a stream, and it was found in January in 1958 or something like that. And it was clearly not in a residential area, and it was next to a stream. So obviously tropical milkweed has been there for a while. However, that's all he found, right? And so I guess I'm saying this because it used to be that there wasn't so much tropical milkweed in Florida. Nowadays, if you look at, if I go to here, will you see this?
Yes.
Okay, this is iNaturalist, which is a great resource for people to look at maps of different species of animals or plants. And just for grins, I pulled up a map here of tropical milkweed. And these are all the reported sightings of tropical milkweed in Florida. And this is current as of this year. So as you can see, the state of Florida is basically covered in tropical milkweed right now. And 60 years ago, that wasn't the case. I guess all of that is, I'm saying all of that because I think it's important to know, for people to know how much we humans have changed the state of things in Florida, right? It used to be that only a small portion of Florida was resident. Now all of it is. It used to be that only a small amount of milkweed was available year round in Florida. And now there's milkweed everywhere all year in Florida. The other thing I want to point out is, let me share another screen. And this might be surprising to some folks here. Let me get back to our meeting. Let me stop sharing this one. And let me share a new screen. I'm going to show you a map here of trends in monarch abundance in the United States based on the North American Butterfly Association's data set. I'm working on a project right now with some collaborators, and we've been putting together some maps like this to sort of point out to people where the monarchs are increasing and decreasing. And what I wanted to show people here was that if you look at Florida, everywhere you look, all of the sites that have been monitored in Florida show increasing trends. These boxes down here, these really highlighted boxes here, show significantly increasing trends. In fact, across the entire country, Florida is the one place where the monarchs are really increasing a lot. And that's kind of good and bad, because on the one hand, it's, everybody loves monarchs and it's good to see them increasing in a certain place. But on the other hand, Florida is like the last place where we want monarchs to be increasing because of this parasite. Let me stop sharing here. So I guess this is another sort of issue that we've changed for the monarchs, right? It used to be that monarchs were there in Florida just some of the time, right? And now they're there year round, and there's a lot more of them than there ever used to be. That's good and bad, because the problem with Florida is when you increase the monarch abundance in Florida, you're increasing the parasite abundance in Florida. And that's kind of not a good thing, right? So, me being in Georgia, I'm especially worried because I feel like that range of parasite prevalence, of high prevalence, is going to keep expanding northward into Georgia. And in fact, it already is in Savannah. But essentially, this is going to sort of keep pushing that envelope further out. So I see monarchs as doing really well in Florida. And there's almost really no reason to have more monarchs. I would suggest, if there's somebody who really, so first of all, I think people need to be aware that monarchs are not in trouble in Florida. You don't have to rear them. I mean, God, no, don't rear the monarchs in Florida. I mean, that would just be horrible, because you're rearing infected monarchs. Monarchs don't even need more milkweed in Florida based on the numbers, right? It doesn't seem like it seems like they have all the milkweed they need now, almost too much. So that's another thing that might be surprising to people. And I'd almost wonder if people are going to hate me for this, if having less milkweed would be better for monarchs in Florida, because when you have milkweed in Florida, you're creating a place for the parasite to proliferate, even if it's native. So that's the problem with Florida. If you put a native milkweed out in your backyard, it's going to be colonized by infected monarchs that are all flying around the neighborhood, right? And so even if it's native, it's going to be a place where the OE spores are going to deposit. The good thing about native is that, I mean, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, it will die back at some point.
It will, yeah.
So that's kind of what we want to see. because when the plant dies back, the spores will disappear, and then it'll come back fresh again. But once it comes back, it'll just become colonized by more parasites again. So the problem with Florida is that, I keep saying this, is that more monarchs equals more parasites. And so, one way to approach this is to have less monarchs in Florida, or less places for them to breed. Like I said, they're not hurting. They don't need more milkweed. So that's one thing I think people might need to consider. Like, if you're planting a butterfly garden, maybe not include milkweed, because if you have milkweed, you're enhancing the OE prevalence. And so it almost would be beneficial for the monarchs to not have a place to lay eggs in your backyard, because then you can sort of claim that you're not helping to spread this parasite. I know that sounds crazy, because everybody wants monarchs. And there are some people who would say, well, an infected monarch is better than no monarchs. But I would say no. It really would be better if there were no infected monarchs, at least at the local scale. Now, the other thing I've heard when I've said this to people is that, well, if you get rid of all the tropical milkweed in Florida, you'd have no monarchs. But that's not the case either, because in Florida, one thing I didn't mention is that, and we've always known this, every year Florida gets a fresh infusion of healthy monarchs from the rest of the eastern seaboard. They all fly down to Florida. We don't know why. We don't know if it's a mistake or if it's on purpose. But we do know that Florida always gets a new generation of healthy monarchs that enter Florida every year. And it might be that sort of fresh infusion every year is what's keeping the population around. Because you could wonder, how can a population that's so infected be sustained for so long? And that's probably the reason, because every year you're getting a fresh batch of monarchs. I mean, how does that sound? It sounds crazy, right?
No, I actually completely agree with you. And as someone who researches other butterfly species and moth species, I'd like to advocate those species over the monarch, because in a lot of ways, they need more help, at least here in South Miami. That's why we have the Atala program, and we try to push for other host plants for other species.
I can appreciate that sentiment, and in this work that I'm doing with my colleagues, looking at the monarch numbers, in doing this project, we can see that there are a lot of other species out there that really are doing worse than the monarch, but people have this sort of this love affair with the monarch, and they really want the monarchs in their backyard. And I think people need to hear that from people like yourself more often. Like, there are other species out there that are in much worse shape than the monarch, especially in Florida. Well, I mean, it's good to hear that we're on the same page here. I mean, if you told somebody this, I suspect they'd get mad at you, right? Because they really want the monarchs in their backyard.
Yes, they do give me some pushback. So it can be difficult at times, but we're trying our best.
I mean, and maybe it would help to get this blog out, to have, so that they can see, there are other scientists who feel the same way. Not everybody. I mean, in fact, even my wife and I can't quite agree on the situation in Florida, because, as she points out, and she's always right, when we talk, there are other species of Danaids down there that used milkweed, and they aren't as seriously infected or affected by this OE parasite, like the queens and the soldier that you have down there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they could benefit from having the milkweed in the backyard. I think if there's so much pushback, and if people are just adamant that they're going to have milkweed in their backyard, one thing you could stress for sure is that people need to try to ensure that it's seasonal milkweed. resist the temptation to have monarchs year round, right? It sounds so crazy, but you know, and having a cute little caterpillar on your plants in January sounds fun, but really that's a sign of impending doom, right? Because if you have caterpillars in your backyard in January, that means you have milkweed in leaf in January, which means it's covered in spores.
Right.
And so the only way to break the cycle of the spores is to, you know, do what native milkweeds do, which is die back every year. So, you know, if people have to, you know, try to maintain a seasonality, which means cut back that milkweed if they have it. I mean, tropical milkweed is really so bad. People really shouldn't be planting that thing, but it's so hard to stop people too, especially in Florida, because the people in Florida think it's okay, I'm immune to all that stuff because my monarchs don't migrate.
Right. I would like to see people watch monarchs the same way that birders watch different species migrate. So maybe we could, you know, get them to view it in that way, like seasonal. Yeah,
I mean, I can totally empathize with that. I mean, it's really, speaking of birders, I mean, birders sort of watch from a distance, and I think that's what people should be doing with butterflies too. I mean, this is kind of a segue into, you know, my all-encompassing take-home message for all things monarch these days. You know, based on the data I've seen, based on the research, based on the evidence from all of the latest studies, you know, I've come to the conclusion that the best thing we can do for monarchs is simply leave them alone. Just have some habitat for them, but just walk away from it and just don't mess with them. Just watch them from a distance. Let them live out their lives. If we just sort of keep our hands off of them, I think they would, you know, they would live their lives, even if it's short. That's what they're supposed to do, right? Monarchs are part of the food chain, and I think, you know, they would be better off if we just stop messing with them. I mean, it's pretty clear. I mean, getting back to my earlier comments about Florida, that we have changed Florida, you know, for the monarch. I mean, in the past 60 years, Florida has greatly changed. Maybe for the benefit of the monarch, depending on your point of view, but also for the benefit of this parasite. And that's the crux of this problem for Florida.
Right.
So I guess my take-home message for this conversation is that, you know, less monarchs might be good for Florida, which would mean less parasites, and, you know, no tropical milkweed. Keep things seasonal as much as possible, and maybe even don't even plant for the monarch, you know, because like you said, there's all these other species out there that need their host plants much more so than the monarch does, especially in Florida.
Absolutely.
All right. Any final thoughts that you want to? I didn't mean to take over the conversation here, but is there anything else you want people to know while you have the chance?
Sure. So if you do reside in South Florida, I would advocate to look up some local butterflies here besides the monarch, some of them being the Atala hairstreak, the Florida dusky wing. They have a host plant called locust berry. You can purchase that at local nurseries. There are several butterfly species and moth species that need more help. And all it takes is just planting the right host plant and giving them the habitat they need.
Awesome, good message. Well, I want to thank you for sort of being on my show, so to speak. I'll post this video to my blog, and you know, maybe it'll be of use to people, and you know, I'd be happy to follow this up with further conversations if needed. But I appreciate what you do, and keep up the good work. And you know, thanks again.
Thank you so much.
All right.